You are officially invited. Yes, you. You're invited to join us in Fertility Awareness Mastery Live. This is my 10-week group coaching program designed to help you gain confidence using fertility awareness. Whether you're actively avoiding pregnancy or looking to optimize your cycles for conception, we have a spot for you. We start the last week of February. Are you ready to jump in? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/fam to register today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 398. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I teach women's health professionals how to utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices, and I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health, because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with me today. I'm excited to share today's episode, the first episode of 2022, and I'm excited that you're here with me today. I thought I would start off the new year by doing a series on birth control, specifically using fertility awareness for birth control. So for the next couple weeks, I'll be sharing a couple of my very favorite episodes that really zone in to using fertility awareness to prevent pregnancy. And I think it's really important to keep talking about it for many reasons. But I think one of the main reasons is because if you're a longtime listener of the show, then you're more than familiar with fertility awareness at this point. If you've read my book, The Fifth Vital Sign, or if you've read Tony Weschler's Taking Charge of Your Fertility, then you're really kind of, in the know with regards to fertility awareness, the efficacy of it as a birth control method, and the fact that it is a real alternative, especially for women who have had negative experiences on hormonal contraception and are really looking for an alternative or feel like there is nothing else for them. It's extremely, extremely important that fertility awareness be presented as an option. My take on fertility awareness as it pertains to birth control is that although I'm obviously an enthusiast about using fertility awareness to prevent pregnancy, it doesn't mean that I think every single woman is going to be a good fit for the fertility awareness method, nor does it mean that I think even women who it is a good fit for, it would necessarily be a fit for them throughout their entire reproductive lives. So that means that there are some women that choose fertility awareness as their primary birth control method for a number of reasons. So some choose it because they need an alternative to hormonal contraception. Others choose it because they just love the opportunity to get to know their body better, and it just really is a match for them. And maybe they have a science nerd kind of brain like me, and they like to observe that data. And I know for me, it was really empowering to be able to understand my body and kind of feel like I had this way to avoid pregnancy without any external requirements. I don't need any products. I don't need any services. I don't need any hormones. I don't need any prescriptions. I don't need to have appointments with doctors. I could just do this on my own. So there's plenty of reasons why women choose fertility awareness for birth control. But even in those cases, there's plenty of women for whom fertility awareness is not going to work for whatever reason. And there's plenty of women who, even though there might be a point in their life where fertility awareness would be the ideal method for them, it may not have been that whole time. An example of that is if you were in, university or college in your early 20s. I hear a lot of women say to me, well, I wouldn't have been able to do it at that point. I've heard a lot of people say, well, I wasn't responsible enough, or my life wasn't stable enough. And that's completely fine. I think that the important thing, just regards to fertility awareness as birth control, is that I think it should be presented as an option. And I think that mature adult women should be able to then make that decision for themselves if they feel that it's appropriate for them. So this isn't to say that a woman who is a bit younger, in her early 20s, couldn't successfully use fertility awareness to prevent pregnancy. I used it in my very early 20s, and I have many women in that age group in my classes. So this is certainly not to say that it's not a possibility. It's more of just an example that this particular method is not necessarily for everybody at every single stage of their life. And that's why we have options, right? Condoms aren't necessarily for everybody. IUDs aren't necessarily for everybody. The diaphragm isn't necessarily for everybody. I think that the big difference between some of those other methods is that they're more commonly used and recommended. Whereas with fertility awareness, many women never really hear about it because their healthcare practitioners are not recommending it or talking about it. But if you are listening and you are thinking about fertility awareness and wondering if it's something you could do, if it's for you, if you could be successful using it for birth control, I would say the answer is yes, as long as you, one, are serious about using it, and two, if you're actually willing to take the time that it would need to. So if you're wanting to teach yourself and learn on your own, I recommend a minimum of 3 to 6 full cycles. So that's period, ovulation, all the way through a full cycle, a minimum of 3 to 6 times before you start to use the method for birth control. So that does mean that you would have to commit to an alternative non-hormonal method during that time to really learn how to chart. And if you're working with an instructor, that can be truncated down to 2 to 3 cycles, depending on the instructor that you're working with and depending on the method that you're using. So those would be the things. You can do this. If this is what you're wanting to do, if you're new to fertility awareness, if this is all kind of a new idea for you, or if you're a new listener to the podcast and you're wondering if this is real, if this could really work, if I could really prevent pregnancy without hormones, the answer is yes, as long as you are willing and able to take the time to learn it. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and jump into one of my favorite episodes where I break down step by step how to use fertility awareness to prevent pregnancy. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm so excited to chat with you about birth control. It's kind of funny if I think about it. Like, it took me 200 episodes to do a solo show about birth control. That's kind of funny, actually. But, it's really important. And I love talking about using fertility awareness for birth control. I love it so much. And I love it for so many different reasons. I'm sure some of you listening already know why I love it so much. I mean, one of the biggest reasons that I love it, and one of the biggest reasons why I started using fertility awareness as my primary method of birth control, was to avoid having to use hormonal contraceptives. So to be able to not have any type of hormonal impact on my body, to just allow my body to just be and my cycles to just be, but to kind of harness the wisdom and information that my body gives me to avoid pregnancy without having to change anything. I think that's the biggest reason why I really love fertility awareness, especially talking about using it as a birth control method, because when you're able to gain that confidence in using fertility awareness to avoid pregnancy, then it frees you. And the analogy that I often think of is, so I've been using menstrual cups for nearly 20 years. I've been using menstrual cups for as long as I've been charting. So I started using menstrual cups right around that same age, like age 19 or so. And so when I first started using menstrual cups, there was not all of these amazing options as there are now. My very first menstrual cup was a keeper. So you can Google that for those of you who are like, what the heck is that? And it was brown in color, not translucent. It was made of natural gum rubber. So I used menstrual cups pre Diva Cup even. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because when I started using menstrual cups, it was so freeing. Like, I bought one cup and I used it for years. And so every time I walked past the, feminine hygiene aisle, I was like, you kind of feel like, take that, pharmaceutical industry. I don't need your products. Take that, feminine hygiene industry. You don't get my money today. So That same kind of feeling that you get when you can avoid using all of those disposable products for managing your period, it's a very similar feeling that you get when you can manage your fertility without having to go to a doctor, without having to use hormones in your body, without having to really do anything outside of yourself. After you take the time to really learn and to gain that confidence and to fully just understand the method and to know exactly how to use it, then the fear of an unplanned pregnancy goes away because you know how to use the method. And you just have the sense of like, take that, pharmaceutical industry. I don't need your medication. And so that's one of the reasons why I love talking about fertility awareness for birth control, because that's something that most women, we're just not taught. We're not taught about our bodies. We're left feeling dependent on the pharmaceutical industry because we're not really presented with any other options. And even the other non-hormonal options that are effective, such as the condom. The condom is an effective method of birth control. When used correctly, it is 98% effective. I always thought it's interesting nowadays that the condom is kind of not really promoted as an effective form of birth control, but it is. But even the condom being highly effective in preventing pregnancy, we're still basically told that, if you're not on the pill, you're going to get pregnant because that's inevitable and you're fertile all the time and you have no other options. So yeah, this is my jam. I love talking about birth control, using fertility awareness for birth control. All right. So I'm going to go through with you 11 points. I'm going to go through with you 11 things that you need to know when you're using fertility awareness for birth control. So we're going to go through them one by one. I'm really excited to take you through them. So let's roll. All right. So number one is chart every day. This is extremely important when you're using fertility awareness in general, but in particular for birth control, you do need to chart your signs every single day, your fertile signs. And so what I'm going to be talking about is the Symptothermal Method. And that is a combination of your cervical mucus, your cervical position, if you check your cervix, as well as your basal body temperature. And I do want to note that I know that not everybody listening uses the same method of charting. So there's lots of different methods of charting your cycles. Some women will use basal body temperature only. Some women use cervical mucus only with no temperature. And some women don't check their cervical position. But I'm going to be talking about all three. So like I said, there's lots of different ways to chart. But regardless of which method you use or exactly how you chart, the one thing that is in common is that you do have to chart every day and you do want to write down those observations. So the two parts, like number one, observation, and number two, actually write it down. And so that's really important because when you are wanting to transition to using fertility awareness as your primary method of birth control, there's a significant mental shift that has to take place. So as women, we're taught a lot of things about our cycle. I mean, we're taught that we're fertile every single day, but we're also taught that our cycles are always 28 days. Ovulation always happens on day 14. And it really sets up this expectation that your cycle is always going to be a certain way. And it sets up an expectation that when you start charting your cycles, all you need to do is pay attention long enough to understand your quote unquote rhythm. And then once you get that, then it's kind of like you just know from then on how your cycle is going to be. So that's a myth. That's not actual reality. So I've seen thousands of women's charts. I've worked with hundreds of women personally, over the years. And what I can tell you is that no, even within the same woman's chart. So even if you looked at this, like even if you pick a woman, whoever she is, and you look at her charts over the course of a year, what you'll notice is that she does not have the same cycle just repeated over and over and over again. You'll notice that her cycles are not all of the same length. There's variation in the length of her cycles. You'll notice that she does not ovulate on the same day every single cycle. You'll notice that there's just different variations and fluctuations, perhaps in the number of days of mucus that she has or the quality of her period. You'll just notice some fluctuations. And so with that being said, it's really important to get into the mindset that I'm going to actually chart every day. Fertility awareness is not about knowing your body. I mean, I feel like I can say that. Fertility awareness is not about knowing your body, quote unquote. It's about understanding how to identify which days are fertile and which days are not, knowing that can shift from cycle to cycle. And so really and truly what we're doing is paying attention each day. So if today is Friday, Then we're going to take a look at we're going to check our fertile signs on Friday. So on Friday, I'm going to check for cervical mucus throughout the day. I'm going to check my cervical position. I'm going to check my temperature first thing when I get up in the morning. And based on what I see on Friday, I'm going to then decide whether or not I'm fertile. I'm not going to base my decision of whether or not I'm fertile on when I think I'm going to ovulate this month because of when I ovulated last month or any of that stuff. I'm actually just going to pay attention to what I see today. So that's the first thing, charting every day and really getting into that mindset of whether or not I'm fertile is based on what I see today. That's how this works. So number 2 is master your cervical mucus. And so this is key. Cervical mucus is the key to understanding your fertility. And the reason for that is that sperm resides in cervical mucus. It can live in cervical mucus. Without cervical mucus, sperm can't survive. So basically, whether you're fertile or not is based on whether you have cervical mucus or not that day. And so then cervical mucus takes on this really important meaning because you produce cervical mucus as you approach ovulation. So as ovulation approaches, you experience certain changes in your hormonal profile. So as you approach ovulation, you produce increasing amounts of estrogen. And as your estrogen rises, that is what triggers the production of cervical mucus. So not only is cervical mucus what keeps sperm alive, if you've ever heard someone say, okay, sperm can live in your body for up to 5 days, it's because of cervical mucus. That's what keeps it alive. It's the right pH. It has nutrients to feed them. It's a very similar pH to a man's own seminal fluid. So cervical mucus is actually critical for sperm survival. And when you're outside of your fertile window and you're not making cervical mucus, sperm can't survive. Sperm actually dies in your vagina because without cervical mucus, your vagina is too acidic for sperm to survive in. So, I mean, that's one key thing about why we need to master cervical mucus. But, another thing is that you're producing cervical mucus as you approach ovulation. And so it's an indication, a sign that your body's preparing for ovulation. So one of the things about, again, the way that we're taught about our bodies is that we're taught that the only thing that matters is ovulation. And so a lot of women are focused on, okay, which day am I ovulating on? How do I have sex on that day? And basically with that understanding that that's the only day that matters, as long as we know when ovulation day is, then we can figure out how to get pregnant or avoid it. But that's not true. So ovulation only happens on one day of the cycle and the egg doesn't live very long. So once the egg is released from your ovary, it's gone after about 12 to 24 hours. So that's it. And the reason that our bodies make the cervical mucus is to extend that window of fertility so that it's more than just 12 hours. Like, could you imagine if there was only 12 hours every menstrual cycle that you could possibly get pregnant? It would be a lot harder to get pregnant if you were trying. And so cervical mucus allows the sperm to survive. It keeps them alive so that by the time you ovulate, the sperm is already there hanging out, well fed, well nourished, waiting for the egg. So that is helpful to know when you're trying to conceive, but it's also critical to know when you're avoiding pregnancy, because that helps you to figure out which days of your cycle are fertile and which days are not. So it's really important to gain confidence and really understand how to check for cervical mucus, how to identify the different types of cervical mucus so that you can be really, really confident about which days you can get pregnant on. So when you're avoiding pregnancy, when you see cervical mucus, so there's two main types of cervical mucus. There's peak and non-peak. And so peak, most women are familiar with that if you've been around the fertility awareness world at all. Peak mucus is clear, it's stretchy, it's slippery. It looks like raw egg whites, basically. So, and it has this really slippery quality about it so that when you're wiping yourself, you actually feel pretty slippery. And a lot of women have noticed that, whether they knew about it or not. Some women think that it's an infection and they run to their doctor because they have discharge. And then other women will feel this kind of wet sensation and run to the bathroom thinking that their period's going to start. And it turns out that there's no period there and they get kind of confused. So when you're using fertility awareness as your primary method of birth control, it's really important to know. So we've got peak mucus and then we have non-peak. So peak is the clear, stretchy stuff. And then non-peak is basically everything else. So non-peak is more like the lotiony, like women will call it like lotiony. So it's kind of like opaque, it's white in color, and it looks like hand lotion that you put between your fingers. So the important thing to know is that as you approach ovulation, regardless of whether you're seeing peak mucus or non-peak mucus, both types are considered to be fertile, because as you approach ovulation, when you start making mucus, that is your sign. That's your body telling you that it's preparing for ovulation. I know that, there's a lot of women who will think, okay, well, if it's lotiony, it's not as fertile, quote unquote, as the peak mucus. But it's important to know that they're both equally fertile when you are approaching ovulation. So when you're in your pre-ovulatory phase, you haven't ovulated yet, and you start to see lotiony mucus and you start to see clear, stretchy mucus. It's important to know both of those types of mucus are fertile. And so that's a big part of mastering your cervical mucus. And that's a huge thing that's really important to know when you're using this method for birth control, to be really, really clear on the different types of mucus and to know how to check for mucus and to know how to kind of interpret what's going on there. Okay, so number 3, master your basal body temperature. Although there are methods of fertility awareness that don't require basal body temperature charting. And ultimately, you can use fertility awareness successfully without temperature. If you're very, very comfortable and confident in charting your cervical mucus, it is possible to chart without basal body temperature. However, as someone who teaches women how to chart and someone who's charted myself for all these years, I can tell you that basal body temperature is extremely helpful in pinpointing ovulation. It's a great way to really kind of differentiate between your pre-ovulatory phase and post-ovulatory phase. It's like you put it on a graph. It can be pretty straightforward. And especially for women who are just first starting to learn and still trying to kind of figure out and understand and gain confidence in using their cervical mucus and kind of interpreting all of the different changes within cervical mucus in the fertile window, the basal body temperature is a great way. It's a great secondary sign to add to mucus so that you can feel even more confident. If you're anything like me, like more information is often good. And most of my clients really appreciate having additional information, having something to kind of triangulate. So when you have two signs, the mucus and the basal body temperature, and you're able to use them together, then it gives you more information. And that helps you to feel even more confident. For those of you who aren't that familiar with basal body temperature, it's a measure of your resting metabolism. And what's really interesting is that after you ovulate, as your progesterone levels rise, that raises your body temperature. So when you're charting your cycles and you're taking your temperature each morning, you can actually see the change in your temperature after ovulation. And for women who are charting their cycles then and actively using fertility awareness as their primary form of birth control, this is fantastic news. So once you understand what's happening in your cycle, and okay, so at the beginning of your cycle, you have your period, and then you typically have a few days before you start seeing cervical mucus. As you go into your fertile window, you'll start to see cervical mucus, and that'll lead up to ovulation. So of course, I'm talking about like the cycle in general, like a healthy cycle. And so after ovulation, then your mucus should dry up, and then you would have your luteal phase. So then you'd have about 2 weeks. So about 12 to 14 days after ovulation without cervical mucus. And after ovulation happens, your cervical mucus dries up. Or you'll remember that I said that sperm can't live in your body unless you have cervical mucus. So your mucus dries up. We'll talk a little bit more about the cervical position, but your cervix closes. So like it's actually closed. You can feel the difference. You can feel the shift. And ovulation only happens once in the cycle. So once ovulation happens, that's it. There are a series of hormonal changes that occur after ovulation that prevent further ovulation. And you can actually feel that change and witness it for yourself. So you don't have to take my word for it. You can actually pay attention and feel the change in your cervix. So you can feel that it's closed now. You can see that you no longer have cervical mucus, and you can see your temperature going up, meaning that there's no more ovulation that cycle. So it's great news when you're charting specifically for the purpose of birth control, because once you've confirmed ovulation with the temperatures, then you know that you can no longer get pregnant for the rest of your cycle. And so that's one of the reasons why, there's a good number of women who use fertility awareness as temperature only, because once you understand how the temperature works and you really get comfortable and confident using temperature to confirm ovulation, then it's a highly effective method of birth control, because once that temperature, goes up and stays up and you understand, the other signs match up, you know that you've ovulated already and you can't ovulate again for the rest of your cycle. Sperm can't live in your body. And so you can't get pregnant for the rest of your cycle. So mastering your basal body temperature is key to using fertility awareness for birth control. It's just, to be honest, I would have a hard time using fertility awareness without the option of basal body temperature, just because I really like it. I really like having that additional piece of data. All right, so that brings me to number 4. So number 4 is always do a cross check. So this is basically bringing together the signs that we're talking about already. So we talked about cervical mucus and basal body temperature. And so what a cross check is looking at those two signs and waiting for them to match up. And that's to confirm ovulation. Interestingly enough, this doesn't only apply to birth control. It's also really important when you're trying to conceive that you match up those signs to verify ovulation. I've seen a lot of women make assumptions, I think I ovulated, but they don't wait for those signs to match up. And so maybe they stop having sex, like they stop trying, and they miss out on some of the best days before ovulation actually took place. So doing a cross-check, all that means is it kind of gets into the rules. So for those of you who've tried it for a while, you might know that there are some specific rules about fertility awareness charting in order to put a buffer around your fertile window so that you can't get pregnant. So you're fertile on the days that you have mucus, and then when your mucus dries up, you have to add 3 days as a buffer so that you can just ensure that you did in fact ovulate, your mucus did in fact dry up, your cervix did in fact close, and when you're charting temperature, that your temperature in fact went up. When you're taking your temperatures, what you'll notice is when you plot them in your app or on paper, you'll see that your pre-ovulatory temperatures fall within a certain range. And then after ovulation, you'll see a rise. So the temperature rises, and then it then stays up for the rest of the cycle if you did ovulate. And so in order to confirm ovulation, then you'd have to wait until you have 3 temperatures that are higher than the previous 6. So if you look at a graph, you would see a very clear rise, and you would be able to take a ruler and draw a line between the two. So you'd see that the pre-ovulatory temperatures are lower than the post-ovulatory temperatures. So all this means is that when you're using fertility awareness for birth control, and you're using the Symptothermal Method, so you're charting both mucus and basal body temperature, you're going to wait until both of those signs line up before you can say, okay, I confirmed ovulation and I'm actually going to have sex in my luteal phase, in my post-ovulatory phase. So you wait until both of those signs match up. All right. Number 5, know the difference between a fertile day and an infertile day. So, that seems pretty obvious. Obviously, you can't use this method for birth control if you don't know the difference between a fertile day and an infertile day. But that's exactly my point. It's really important to be clear on that, to know exactly how to differentiate. I think a lot of women are clear on the post-ovulatory infertile period because, as you remember from the previous point, when you see that both of those signs have lined up, so your mucus dried up and your temperature rose and it stayed high, that confirms ovulation. And so for the rest of the cycle, okay, I confirmed it. I know I ovulated, and so I know these days are not fertile. But the challenge comes in the pre-ovulatory phase, because before ovulation, in order to identify which days are fertile and infertile, you have to be really clear on what you're seeing in terms of your cervical mucus observations. So that's what I mean when I say know the difference between a fertile day and an infertile day. So I touched on this already when I talked about the 2 different types of mucus. So knowing that both peak mucus and non-peak mucus are fertile, that's really important so that you're not guessing, so that you don't think, oh, well, I just have a little bit of mucus today. It's totally fine for me to have sex. Knowing that when you see mucus, that makes it a fertile day. So if you're in your pre-ovulatory phase and you see cervical mucus, it's a fertile day. So there's that. But a big part of being clear on that is knowing the difference between like a dry day and a mucus day. And so like I mentioned, there's all kinds of different ways to chart. There's different ways to check for cervical mucus. There's different charting modalities. There's lots of different organizations that teach charting. And at the end of the day, in order to use fertility awareness effectively for birth control, you're going to need to be able to tell the difference between a fertile day and an infertile day. Now, number 6 is find your cervix. So I'll put a caveat on this that it is possible to chart without checking your cervix. Cervix is an optional sign. Every woman does not check her cervix and doesn't necessarily need to check her cervix in order to feel comfortable with the method. But there are situations where I do encourage my clients to check their cervix. And so one of those situations is when there are limited and or very little cervical mucus observations. So, unfortunately, just given the reality of the realities of hormonal birth control, for women who have been on hormonal birth control for a really long time, it is common. It's not something that you see every single time, but it is common for women who've used hormonal birth control for a really long time. So, several years, maybe 10 years or more, to have less mucus when they first come off of birth control. And so there's a reason for that. Hormonal birth control changes the structure of your cervix, and it increases the crypts that produce your cervical mucus plug. So basically you end up with fewer of the cervical crypts that make the peak clear, stretchy mucus. And so, not everyone's the same. Some women come off of hormonal birth control and their mucus is flowing fine. There's no problems. And then other women come off of hormonal birth control and they have very few days of mucus. And some of my clients have, rarely have any days of actual peak mucus. So they'll see a bit of a change and they might see some non-peak mucus as they approach ovulation. But some of my clients with a history of long-term birth control use won't have any. And so in those situations, the cervix becomes really helpful and important to help you identify when you're in your fertile window. Because again, if you can't use one of the primary pieces of information that you need to use in order to use fertility awareness, then you have to rely on, as the other options in terms of information gathering. And so that basically involves checking your cervix. So checking your cervix every day for a full cycle, at least so that you have an understanding of what your cervix does, how it feels, what it feels like when you're in your fertile window, and what it feels like after ovulation. And that really helps because once you can start to identify the changes, how your cervix changes when you're in your fertile window and how your cervix changes after ovulation, it gives you another piece of data that can help you to identify your fertile window and help you to feel more confident about using this method for birth control. So one of the things that I always say to my clients is that all of the changes that you're seeing throughout your menstrual cycle are happening as a direct result of the hormonal changes. So as your estrogen rises, that is what triggers all of these changes. So estrogen is what triggers changes in your cervix. It's what triggers changes in your cervical mucus. And it's ultimately what triggers ovulation. And so then after ovulation, it's progesterone that triggers, the changes in your cervix again, the changes in your cervical mucus production. So what you're seeing is a result of these hormones. And since it's all connected, when you pay attention to these signs, they line up. So your cervical mucus production is going to line up with your cervical position and the texture of your cervix, where your cervix is in your vagina. And it's going to line up with your temperatures, the temperature changes. I mean, sometimes it doesn't line up like exactly with the day. And so you'd have to kind of look further into your chart to identify some of those anomalies. But ultimately, it's really helpful to keep in mind that these are all changes that are happening simultaneously because of the hormones. Finding your cervix is very helpful when you're using the method, especially what I always say as well is that it's helpful to know how your cervix changes in your cycle, because if you ever have a cycle where your mucus is off or you couldn't check your temperature because of you were sick or something like that, it's really, really helpful to have your cervix as a third sign to kind of triangulate everything else. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with the changes in your cervix, as you approach ovulation, your cervix will change. It typically will get softer. It'll change position in your vagina. You might find that it's a little bit higher than normal. And then after ovulation, you'll find that your cervix, it firms up. So it feels a little bit firmer. And you might find that it's a bit lower. Like if you try to find it, you might find that it's higher around ovulation and lower after ovulation. So every woman's cervix is not exactly the same. And there are certainly nuances to look for. But the most significant and obvious change that occurs is the change that happens after you ovulate. So the cervix can be a really, really helpful third sign to confirm ovulation. So especially if you have some temperatures that are kind of wonky or some cervical mucus that doesn't really make that much sense, if you pay attention to your cervix as a third sign, then the cervix is really clear of when ovulation happens, as long as you've given yourself an opportunity to get familiar with it. So yes, get to know your cervix, find it, love it, check it, chart it, and it'll help you to make sense of the other two signs, especially in a pinch. All right, number 7. This is really important. Know what to do when in doubt. So, I mean, life is life. Life happens. As much as we have the best intentions, it's not every single day of our lives that goes exactly as planned. And so there's going to be, I mean, if you're anything like me and you're charting over several years of your life, I mean, if you find fertility awareness towards the beginning or the middle of your reproductive life, so like mid-20s, 30s, like you still have decades, potentially like decade singular or maybe even decades plural to chart your cycles. So what that means is that you're going to have some days where you don't get a chance to chart, or you forget to take your temperature, or you forget to write down what you saw. It's just life. And so what's really important is it goes back to number 1. So number 1 was chart every day. And also to really get that sense of fertility awareness is about on every day, am I fertile or not that day based on what I saw. So if you didn't check, if you didn't look at your signs that day, if you didn't check for mucus that day, if you didn't take your temperature that day, if you didn't check your cervix that day, then you don't know what's going on. And you can't assume that you know based on what you had a previous cycle. So if you don't check, you don't know what's happening. And therefore you have to assume that you're fertile. So all it means when I say, do you know what to do in doubt? When you're in doubt, and so doubt means you're not really understanding what you're seeing on your chart, or you didn't really check. And so you don't actually know if you had mucus or not that day, like you legitimately don't know because you didn't look. Then that means you have to consider yourself fertile, plus a buffer period. So that's really important. It's time, ladies. Time to take your fertility awareness knowledge and confidence to the next level. Just popping into today's episode to invite you to join us for the next round of Fertility Awareness Mastery Live. My 10-week group coaching program is designed to help you unlock the secrets of your menstrual cycle. Fertility Awareness Mastery teaches you everything you need to know about using fertility awareness cycle tracking to achieve your intentions. Whether you're currently trying to get pregnant, avoiding pregnancy, or planning to conceive in the future, we've got you covered. This program goes deep. Get to the root of your period problems, hormone imbalances, fertility challenges, and so much more. Early bird registration is now open, but only for a limited time. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/fam to register today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. And so that brings me to number 8. So number 8, which is the buffer period. You can call it the count of 3, you can call it the rule of 3, or you can call it a buffer period. But either way, I mentioned it a little bit, which is that, fertility awareness, just in the general sense, understanding that you produce mucus around ovulation and that there's several, basically there's only 6 days of your cycle when you can get pregnant. That general understanding is different than kind of following specific rules to avoid pregnancy. So when it comes to the specific rules for trying to avoid pregnancy, those rules basically add a buffer period to ensure that you're going to not get pregnant if that's what you're going for. So what that means is that when you see cervical mucus and your mucus dries up, you don't automatically assume that the day after, so let's say today is Friday, and let's say that you have cervical mucus on Friday, And then Saturday, you don't have any mucus. And Sunday, you don't have any mucus. So basically, you ovulated and your mucus is done. So you can't just have sex on the Saturday. You need to give yourself a bit of a buffer. So that would be the count of three or the rule of three. And so basically, what that buffer period does is it gives you basically 3 days grace so that you can take a moment to confirm whether or not you actually did ovulate. My clients will often hear me say, especially if the chart is a little bit like this, just not clear, we're not really sure if ovulation happened, we're not really sure based on what we're seeing because it's not clear. You'll often hear me say, well, wait 3 days and see what happens. Wait 3 days and see what happens. And the reason that I say that is because let's say that you are charting your cycles and you had several days of cervical mucus, and then you notice that your mucus dried up. So again, like you had mucus up until Friday, and then Saturday you don't have any mucus. But when you took your temperature didn't rise. And so like it looks like you ovulated because the mucus isn't there, but the temperature didn't change. And so then you take your temperature the following day and it still didn't change. So, in those situations, I've had many clients will say, well, I must have ovulated. But until you see the data, and until the data lines up, you can't make those kinds of assumptions because I've seen the other side where the mucus went away, maybe because something stressful happened. So meaning that you didn't ovulate and that's why the temperatures didn't rise. And so then a couple days later, mucus comes back and then all of a sudden you ovulate. So if you're trying to avoid pregnancy, it's really, really important not to go on your feelings. So kind of like, I don't want to say ignore your feelings, but I'm kind of saying it like ignore your feelings because you want to go on the data. So you want to make sure that you give yourself that 3-day buffer period, especially if you're in doubt, if you're not sure what you're seeing, and also just the standard. You give yourself 3 days after the mucus dries up to verify that it was in fact ovulation. When your temperature rises, you wait until you see 3 high temperatures so that you can confirm that ovulation actually happened. And then you look at both of those signs and put them together to make sure they match up. So 3 days of dried up mucus plus 3 days of high temperatures. And then together, that gives you more information. It gives you more data. It allows you to do the cross-check. And so then you can feel more confident about what you're doing. And so this is the difference between actively using fertility awareness as a birth control method and then versus having this idea that what's going to happen in your cycle. So when you're actually using the method and following the rules correctly, you have a good understanding. If you don't take chances, if you actually follow what the rules are, then that's what leads to the level of effectiveness that the studies tell us is up to 99.4%. And so that is the importance of the buffer period. So number 9 is another really important point. Know where you are on the intention scale. And so the intention scale, I'm sure there's different people, different interpretations of this, but throughout the years, what I found, especially between women who use this method, is that we're all somewhere on the scale between 0 and 10, let's say. So 0 is like, I don't want to have kids right now, ever at all. 0 kids. I'm not available to have children. And so I'm 100% committed to not getting pregnant. And then 10 is I want a baby so bad. I've been trying for so long and I still haven't had a baby. So just to kind of give you that sense of 0 to 10. And we're all on that scale somewhere, but not all of us are super polarized. Everybody is in a 0 and everybody is in a 10. And so part of using fertility awareness and relying on it for birth control, part of it is having a conversation with yourself to really get a sense of where you are actually at. So, there's a lot of women who, although they may not be actively trying and they don't really want to have a baby right now, they might be willing to take certain risks because it's not totally out of the question for them to have a child right now. And so ultimately the method is the same, but the person is different. So a person who is who's not trying to conceive and is very much at a 0, no children right now, they may be adverse to certain risks that another woman might take. And it's not about judgment. It's not about anything. It's just about getting really clear on what your intentions are and adding that to your understanding of the method to use it correctly. And that certainly plays into another really important part of using fertility awareness for birth control, which is managing your fertile window. So, knowing where you are in terms of where you are on the intention scale, it really governs how you're going to manage your fertile window. So, some of my clients will not have any sex during their fertile window. So, they'll use fertility awareness in earnest, in the way that it's intended. So the studies that have been done on fertility awareness, in those studies, then the couple doesn't have sex on their fertile days. So this isn't to say what you should or shouldn't do ultimately, but it's important to know that if you are using the fertility awareness method and you identify that, you identify your fertile window. If you have sex on those days that you've identified as fertile and you use a condom or you use a diaphragm or you use withdrawal or some other type of birth control, it's really important to know that when you have sex on your fertile days, you're not using fertility awareness. Like if you're having sex and you use a condom, like you're using a condom. And so your effectiveness is going to be based on the condom. Or if you use a cervical cap, or if you use a diaphragm, or if you use withdrawal or something like that, like you're not actually using fertility awareness on those days. On those days, you're using the barrier method that you chose. And so then the effectiveness is based on the barrier. And so where you are on that intention scale is going to govern how you manage that window. So some women won't have, like they'll abstain, like they won't have sex. Other women may choose to have alternate sex. So no, penetration, penile vaginal penetration, but they'll have, other activities that don't involve penis and vagina. And other women will use withdrawal, or they'll use condoms, or they'll use, all the different types of birth control. And so having that conversation with yourself of where am I on the intention scale? How comfortable am I with pregnancy right now? Like if I'm at a 0, I have to take that into consideration when I'm just figuring out how I'm going to manage my fertile window, versus if you're a little bit more, if you're kind of like not decided and you're wanting to let that decision be made for you. So I think in terms of effectively using fertility awareness for birth control, it just involves a grown-up conversation with yourself and with your partner about how you're going to manage your fertile window and what would happen if you were using a condom and the condom slipped off. What would you do in that situation? And so ultimately, that's part of it too. And interesting when we think about having this conversation with fertility awareness, but it's the same conversation you have to have with any other type of birth control. So even hormonal birth control or condoms, or, there's failure rates with all birth control methods. So regardless, it's important to have these conversations. But I think when you're using fertility awareness, it just becomes more apparent that you should be really thinking about these things and figuring out, okay, how am I going to manage my fertile window, and have that conversation with your partner about what you're going to do, what you would do to manage anything that did happen. All right. So number 10. Getting your partner on board. And so I've had a lot of questions about this come up in my Facebook group. And of course, this is a topic that comes up in my client work. And I just want to share with you an interesting observation that I've made over the years. So the majority of the women that I work with are, partnered with male partners. And what I find is that overwhelmingly their partners are actually very supportive. And so for those of you who have been using fertility awareness, or for those of you who this is, new to you, and maybe this is something that you're just starting to communicate with your partner about, my experience has been so far that overwhelmingly, the majority of the women who I've worked with, their partners are actually really, really supportive. And there's a number of different reasons for that. I think one of the reasons is when concerns of health come up. So if a woman had a really negative, for instance, if you had a really negative experience on hormonal birth control and it, changed you emotionally and you reacted badly to it, then, a lot of partners they just don't want they just don't want you to suffer. They don't want you to take anything that's actually having a negative impact on your health. And just beyond that, just to kind of support what you're doing. But for those of you who are concerned about how to get your partner on board, I do have just a couple of suggestions for how to make that a bit easier. And the first one might come as a surprise, but the first step to getting your partner on board is actually to make sure that you're educated about it. And so when you're not yet confident about what you're talking about, when you're not yet confident in the method and you don't fully understand how it works and you can't really communicate that clearly to your partner, that makes it a little bit more challenging, because then it's not necessarily that your partner doesn't trust the method or believe you, but if you're not coming across as confident when you describe it because you yourself don't fully understand it yet and you're not fully there with your own confidence, then that's a big deal. So I would say the very first step to get your partner on board is to fully educate yourself. So ultimately, I have yet to have a male approach me to learn fertility awareness and to join one of my programs, although the programs are for women, but it's tongue in cheek there. But ultimately, if you are in a relationship and you're wanting your partner to come on board with fertility awareness, then you are the first point of contact. You're the one that has to educate your partner about it. And before you can educate somebody else about something, you have to actually educate yourself. And the only way that it's going to come across as, valid and to have someone else be confident in it is if you're confident in it to begin with. So I would say the first step is to take the time that you need to fully understand the method, to fully learn the method. And especially if you are planning to rely on fertility awareness as your primary method of birth control, especially if you've recently come off the pill or if your cycles aren't particularly straightforward, or even if your cycles are straightforward. I would say that, given just my experience personally using the method, I would say that you will benefit from seeking support just to make sure. So seeking support from a charting instructor in a particular method of fertility awareness so that you can be very, very confident in your ability to chart. And then once you are confident and once you fully understand to the point that you can actually explain it very clearly to your partner and share the learning materials that you have and just really get your partner on board, because they can feel your confidence. They know that you know what you're talking about. It helps your partner to then feel more confident if you are confident. And so this is a conversation that I've had with a number of clients when their partners have questions. It's not necessarily that the partner isn't supportive, but just there's questions about it. It's like, how does this work or how does that work? And it can come across as though they don't believe you or they don't trust you. But at the same time, if you're not communicating confidently about the method, then it can come across on the other side that you don't really know what you're talking about. And that can make it harder for someone to really get on board and trust it. And so I've had conversations with that where I kind of role play with my client about like, okay, so if I was talking to my partner, this is how I would talk about this thing. And this is how I would talk about that thing in these words. And then, why don't you say it back to me? Like, how would you describe this part of it to your partner so that he knows or what's going on this day and why you're doing this and why, and to make it really black and white. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, and this depends a lot on your partner. Everyone's relationship is different. So with some of the women I work with, their partners are really involved and really want to know what's going on and will even just be part of it, be part of the charting. So whether that's like, passing the thermometer to you in the morning or monitoring your charts, like, to absolutely not having anything to do with it and it just being totally up to you to share which days are fertile, which days are not. But wherever it is in your relationship, one of the things that you can do, if appropriate, if it fits the situation, if it fits the relationship with you and your partner, is to share your charts. For instance, like, paper charts are helpful for this. I know not everyone charts with paper, but if your partner is kind of like a data nerd and really wants to know, because sometimes your partner really wants to know, having the chart and having it up. So a number of my clients have done that, where they actually have the paper chart, they have it up somewhere or, on the desk or whatever. And so their partner can see them recording their fertile signs, their mucus, their temperature every day. And so then it's very clear and obvious and very upfront exactly what's happening, to the point where your partner will be able to kind of identify where you are in the cycle. So I completely recognize that it's not like that for everybody. And I'm not saying that it needs to be like that, but I'm saying that for some couples, it's actually really helpful just to have it all out there in the open, so that your partner can clearly see what's going on and be involved and kind of have that bit of understanding, because that's how you get your partner on board, like, so that they kind of understand what is going on and they can see it, and they know what's going on. And then, I mean, there's other ways, depending on where you live, depending on what services are available close to you. It might be possible to even, take a class and bring your partner, or have sessions with somebody. And if your partner really wants to participate, like to have your partner attend a class with you. So there are certain organizations that actually specifically teach couples, so that both partners can be on board, because ultimately with this method, you need the cooperation of both people. And so although it's not something that happens all the time, I have had private sessions with my clients where their partners have attended the session as well. Not necessarily every session, but one or two, so that they can really get a sense of what's happening, and then it just builds confidence. And with that, when you do take a class, when you do take the time to really learn a specific method and gain that confidence, that's another thing. That's another way, because then they can see, like, oh, wait, this is actually a real thing. One of my clients mentioned to me, that, like, wow, you have a lot of sessions with this woman. You're going in a lot of depth. Like, this is real. This is really something serious, something legitimate. And so there's lots of different ways to get your partner on board. But I think that just to get just to get some thoughts out there of how to do it, and what are some of the different ways it could look, and some of the different things that you could do. But ultimately, as long as you're confident and you're able to clearly and confidently explain what's happening, that makes a really big difference. And so that brings me to the last point. So the number 11, what I wanted to share about using fertility awareness for birth control. And so to kind of conclude the list, number 11 is, know that your friends, family, and healthcare practitioners may not support your decision to use FAM. So it's maybe it's not a good idea to end on a downer, but just to put it out there, this is an experience that's really common to a lot of the women who I've worked with. And over the years, a lot of the women who I know, just being a fertility awareness educator, having done this for so long, I know a lot of women who chart their cycles. And so I've heard a lot of different experiences. And when you make this decision initially, so when you first decide to do this, you might be so excited that you're kind of sharing with your friends and your family and your doctors. And I think many women will, make an appointment with their doctor, of course, because they're going off the hormonal birth control, only to find their doctor telling them, like, well, no, you need to be on the pill. If you're not on the pill, then you're going to get pregnant, and really basically telling them this method doesn't work. It's not effective, and you're just going to end up pregnant. So I don't know why you're doing this. So that can be really disheartening. And so I think if you just know that fertility awareness is still, it's not mainstream, although it's made so many strides since when I first discovered it, there was nothing compared to what there is now. There's so much more information available. There's so many more resources. So many more women are doing it. And it's even, getting trendy. Fertility awareness has its own tech now. There's like a whole industry of different thermometers and devices that are targeting women who chart. And when I was first learning, that did not exist at all. That was not a thing. So even with all of those strides, even though fertility awareness has gained just a ton of ground, it's still fringe, and it's still not something that most people know about, and it's still not something that most people are educated about. So even though there's scientific literature, research showing the effectiveness, even though there are, millions of women around the world who practice fertility awareness and use it successfully to avoid pregnancy and use it as a legitimate form of birth control, that doesn't mean that your friends or your family or your health practitioner is going to know about it and is going to support your decision to use it. And so one of the things that there's a couple of different ways to think about it, but ultimately, if you're using fertility awareness and you've really taken the time to educate yourself and to gather resources, to take a class, to really jump in and do this, then know that you probably know more about it than your friends and your family and your healthcare practitioners. Most doctors, most healthcare practitioners are not well educated about fertility awareness and often still believe the kind of dogmatic myths and all of those things out there about the women's menstrual cycle. After all, before each of us discovered fertility awareness, we believed it too. So until I discovered fertility awareness, I believed that I was fertile every single day. And I believed that the pill was really the only way to, prevent pregnancy effectively. So I also, and each of us, I'm sure every single woman who's listening right now, before you discovered fertility awareness, you were that person as well. Ultimately, I think we have to approach the situation with some compassion and understanding and a little just bit of reality. So know that, no one has to agree with your choice to use fertility awareness and no one really needs to understand it either. I think the key, it kind of comes back to that point about getting yourself educated and really gaining that confidence, because when you're confident, when you've taken the time to educate yourself, when you've taken the time to get some resources, connect with a teacher, take a class, really just whatever you need to do to feel confident, then when someone tells you, oh, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's the same way, like if someone were to tell you that you were purple, you're like, I'm not purple. This is silly. When you're really confident and when you've really done your homework and you're really educated about it, then if your doctor tells you like, oh, that doesn't work, you need to be on the pill, then you're in a place where you can say, no, I'm good, thanks. I've been using it. It's working for me, and I'm really confident in it. If I were to go to a doctor and the doctor would tell me that it didn't work, I would just say, I don't even know what I would say, but I probably would just nod my head and go about my day, because I know that it works, because I've been using it for almost 2 decades. So that's the last point of it. So just to go through what you need to know when you're using fertility awareness for birth control, kind of going through one by one. Number 1 is to chart every day. Number 2 is to master your cervical mucus. Number 3, master your BBT, your basal body temperature. Number 4, always do a cross check. Number 5 is know the difference between a fertile day and an infertile day. Number 6 is find your cervix. Number 7 is know what to do when in doubt. Number 8 is understand the buffer period. So know the count of 3. Number 9 is know where you stand on the intention scale. Number 10 is get your partner on board, how to do that. And number 11 is know that your friends, family, and practitioners may not support your decision to use fertility awareness as your primary method of birth control. And so I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I was really excited to share just some thoughts on using fertility awareness for birth control. I do think it involves a bit of a mindset shift for everyone involved. And the first mindset shift is like, whoa, I'm not fertile every single day. There's only a small window of fertility, and I can learn how to figure out what that is. The second part is to kind of like leave behind the thoughts of the rhythm method that we've been trained to believe throughout our whole lives. So leaving behind the idea that, all I need to do is watch my cycle a bit and then I'm going to learn the pattern and I don't have to chart anymore. So really getting a sense of like, I'm going to watch my fertile signs each day. I'm going to get really comfortable with my cervical mucus observations, my basal body temperature, my cervical position. And then at the end of each day, I'm going to know if I'm fertile or not based on what I saw. So kind of getting into that like real time, day-to-day mentality about charting. And then there's always an interesting part of the journey when so you've done your homework, you've gotten some resources, you have taken charge of your fertility, you're taking a class, you're working with an instructor. There's a difference between understanding something in a book theoretically, so knowing theoretically that there are certain days of your cycle when you can have unprotected sex with your partner and not get pregnant, but there's like this when it's kind of like when it becomes real. So it's different knowing, okay, this is how it is. I understand from a scientific standpoint, blah, 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 to actually going and having the sex. Once you've identified your fertile window and you really understand everything. So there's all of these stages that you go through. It's normal to feel nervous and scared. And so as a guideline, when you're working with an instructor, you're going to want to take that very first cycle and not use your cycle, like not use fertility awareness in that first cycle. So you're going to want to take that one full cycle when you're working with an instructor and use protection or don't have sex, but however you're going to manage that, you want to really take the time to go through a full cycle to gain that confidence in identifying your fertile window, identifying ovulation, being really, really confident in how to use all those signs before you start using the method. Now, when you're not working with an instructor, if you're teaching yourself using a book or using other types of resources, then you're going to want to take 3 full cycles to really learn and understand what's happening. And so if that sounds like a little bit much, there's all of these different things that can happen when you start charting your cycles. First of all, getting used to the fact that your cycle isn't going to be the same every single time. Ovulation can fluctuate, can change, it can be delayed, it can come a little bit early depending on what's happening. And so it's very real that your cycle can fluctuate. So it's important to wait 3 cycles so that you get a sense of what your body's actually doing, what your cycles really look like. And there's a lot that can happen in 3 cycles. So it's a really important part of your education to really take that time before you start using the method for birth control. So those are the suggestions, of course, best practices in order to get the most out of the method. But you certainly can kind of curtail that learning curve when you work with somebody who can guide you through that process and kind of share with you all of the different things that can happen. So it cuts down that self-learning time from 3 months to 1 month. And ultimately, what I always tell my clients is that there's no magical number. Some of my clients are really comfortable after that first cycle. So kind of going into cycle number 2 as we're working together, starting with the post-ovulatory phase. And other clients will actually take a couple more cycles to feel confident and comfortable because they're feeling a little bit more conservative and they know where they are on the intention scale. So again, this is a personal decision that everyone has to make for themselves. And not everyone's cycles are the same. So some of my clients, their cycles are super straightforward. Other clients, they have a lot of different challenges and different signs that they're looking at. Perhaps they're having mucus, all the time or not at all. And that both of those scenarios make charting more complex. Perhaps they have delayed ovulation or double peak, meaning that their body moves towards ovulation, so they start to see mucus, but then something happens and their body kind of backs off. And then, a couple days later, the mucus comes back. So whatever the case is, there's different situations that if you're not prepared for them, if you're not ready for them, if you're not following the rules and not waiting for things to match up, then you can end up having sex on a day that is actually fertile, but you didn't realize that it was fertile. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/398. All right. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I feel like it was a really, really good breakdown of the fertility awareness basics about what it really does involve. The 3 main fertile signs, how to track them, how to utilize them to identify when you're in your fertile window and when you're not. And obviously then taking that information and adding to it to allow you to be able to avoid pregnancy naturally. So of course, there's more to it. You can't simply listen to one podcast and then start using fertility awareness for birth control. But hopefully this episode has inspired you to look deeper. If you have been thinking about it, if you've been on the fence and you are really wondering if this method is for you, hopefully this gave you more of a window into what it really looks like. And again, the takeaway that I hope you take from this episode is that it is possible. It's like anything else you have to learn. So when I was in my 20s, I bought a standard car. I didn't know how to drive it. And I had to learn. It took me a couple months to figure it out. And fertility awareness is similar in a number of ways because it is definitely doable as long as you're willing and able to take the time that it needs to learn how to do it. And so with that said, I hope you have a wonderful day, week, weekend, whenever you're tuning into this show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.